Alrighty. Hello, everybody. Thank you for hopping on to our webinar today. Um, while we wait for people to log on, I'm going to start with a quick question for us. Let me see. Um, All right, so we have a quick warm-up poll for you guys as we wait for folks. So the question is, what group of people use social media more for information or like on news? What are we thinking? All right, we still have a couple of answers coming in. So for the question, what group of people use social media for more information on news? We have the correct answer is 50 to 64-year-olds. All right. I know that took me by surprise, and I see that most of you guys thought that 18 to 34-year-olds relied on social media for information, but nope, it is the generation above us. All right, I think since we have a decent amount of people here, we can go ahead and get started. So again, thank you guys for joining us today. Tune in or tune out. Today, we're trying to understand media consumption habits. Just so you guys know, this webinar will be recorded. If you have any questions, feel free to chat with us in the chat box or the Q&A to send a question. I'm Kamel Ash, the Growth and Marketing Manager here. I'm going to hand it over to our CEO, Mike Greenfield, to talk a bit about the history of our company. And you will hear from our analyst, Jessica Mason, a little later. Oops, Mike, it seems you are
Thank
muted.
you. Thank you. Thank you, Kamel. I'm going to go give a little bit of a background on change research and bold research. I co-founded the company in 2017. Our goal is to democratize access to public opinion research so that we can make the world more humane, scientific, and just. We launched Bold in 2021 as a nonpartisan part of our company to help leaders understand what people want and need. And we have an amazing team of pollsters, engineers, data scientists, including Jessica, who you'll hear from today, that provide many different types of companies and organizations with near constant access to public opinion. Our approach, our methodology has been different since day one. We do not call people on the phone. That has become a very difficult way to poll people, and it's not part of the change research and bold research approach. We also don't rely on panels of survey takers who are compensated, who are regularly taking surveys. Instead, we reach people via an approach that we call dynamic online sampling, where we're recruiting new participants for every survey that we run. We run on the order of 100 online ads for every survey that we conduct, to recruit people to take the survey. And we adjust those ads to get a sample that is reflective of the population or the electorate that we're trying to reach. We also use SMS text to web, and that allows us to recruit a fresh sample for every poll that we run, including the polls that you'll learn about today. We pride ourselves very much on being an innovative, technology-oriented company. In addition to what are more typical custom polls, we offer what we call Spark polls, which are pre-written questions for cost-effective polling for both candidate viability and also for renewable energy projects. We have an approach that we call Magnify, which is a new AI-driven targeting custom modeling approach. And then we have a product called Voices, which is a new take on qualitative research. I'm going to go to the next slide, Jessica. Thank you. So since day one, change research has been fast, accurate, and affordable, and those are key tenets of what it is that we do. Our technology orientation and the fact that we're not calling people on the phone allows us to be significantly faster than traditional polling firms. We have a consistent record of accuracy, and we put out a report on after every election that we conduct. We have an accuracy report on our website for the 2024 election, and we pride ourselves on being affordable. We're on around half the price of legacy competitors. Finally, our wealth of data allows for new possibilities. The traditional approach with polling, and something that I saw in the industry that I wanted to change, and that we've tried to change with change research, is that a polling firm will conduct a survey of 600 people or 800 people or whatever the number is, and they will create a report. They'll send that out to the client, and then for all intents and purposes, that data gets thrown away. We think about things a little bit differently, and we're constantly trying to innovate and think about how do we use the data that we've collected and the things that we've learned over the almost 8 years that the change research has been around, 300 million plus data points, millions of surveys that have been taken, and use that to inform our future analysis. And that's something that you'll see in this presentation, and it's something that we're continuing to evolve and iterate on. So let me hand off to Jessica. Jessica is an analyst on the Embold team. She has done a ton of amazing work on news and media, among other subjects. You'll hear about multiple projects today, and I'll let Jessica take it away.
Thanks so much, Mike. I'm really excited to be sharing our findings with you. Before we dive into our findings from our poll on media consumption, we also wanted to showcase a case study of a recent client project we did through Embold, our nonpartisan business unit. We'll then go through and answer some of the big questions about news consumption patterns through our data. First, how do people engage? How does news get to them? Second, who do people trust? How do people decide what's true and what isn't? And lastly, how can we classify news consumption habits? What makes somebody engaged or disengaged, and why does that matter? So first, we want to showcase a recent poll we conducted on behalf of Civic News Company. This poll actually incorporates 2 phases, a national survey and then a survey focused specifically on Chicago. For those who may not be familiar, Civic News is a news organization with a couple of specific area issues, including education. Because of this, we purposely oversampled educators and parents with school-aged children in order to capture one of their key audiences. One of the first things that we found in this poll is that media market matters. What may be true for consumers nationwide may not be true on a local level. We see this in our national survey. Online search is the primary source for information when we look at the grand scale. However, in Chicago, we get a different picture. Here, nearly half of respondents, 49%, say that they primarily rely on in-person networks like friends and family for information. Searching online is still a prominent source, but it's a less common outlet than other things like television or online digital news sites. We also asked Chicago residents their satisfaction when it comes to the topics that are most important to them. We see in the abstract, with very few exceptions, that majorities of residents feel satisfied with the information at their fingertips. But when we dig deeper to ask about their satisfaction in specific situations, this sense of satisfaction wanes. People are much less satisfied with the information they can get when making crucial decisions about where to live, where to work, and how to navigate local policies. Most notably, we wanted to use this question as a litmus test for civic engagement. At the bottom of the chart in the orange box, you'll see we asked folks how satisfied they are with getting the information they need in order to report issues like potholes, broken streetlights, or sidewalk damage. Not only did we find that less than a third of voters are satisfied with getting that type of information, but actually this outsized proportion, 44%, are unsatisfied. There's this crucial gap for residents who may want to improve their communities, but just don't know how. Given Civic News's interest with education, we also asked residents what education topics are most important to them to be informed about, and then how satisfied they are with the information that they're able to receive. And we found a pretty notable disconnect. For the parents, educators, and residents passionate about education news, school safety and curriculum rise to the top. However, only a third of those same people express satisfaction with the information they can get on those topics. Also noteworthy, we see that 4 in 10 say that school funding is a key topic, yet this is one of the areas with the lowest level of information satisfaction. We also wanted to dive deeper into not just what residents want to be informed about, but how they stay informed. And we see among Chicago residents that gathering useful information is typically a self-directed and network-driven search, especially when it comes to these education topics. Residents are primarily relying on in-person networks like friends, family, and other parents to get the information they need. Otherwise, they're turning to searching online for themselves or asking the local school district. Though this provides a challenge for getting needed information to residents, there are some still avenues to reach them. One of the most important findings was that parents in particular heavily rely on email newsletters to get crucial education info. Unlike word of mouth, this is a channel that Civic News can leverage to get out the needed information parents are seeking. I find that this research primes us well for the larger topic at hand, news consumption habits, for 2 reasons. First, it shows us that we can't always trust respondents at face value, and we need to dedicate ourselves to asking deeper, more concrete questions. Our Chicago survey first indicated that residents are satisfied with their information environment. But when we probe deeper, we actually see some clear pain points when it comes to staying informed, especially when it comes to topics that matter most, particularly in the education space. We also are able to use this research to identify where we can reach people. As the news environment becomes more decentralized, we can leverage our research to identify non-traditional channels that can make an impact. Now I want to set the stage for our internal poll. Change Research conducted a poll of just over 1,700 registered voters nationwide using our dynamic online sampling method. The margin of error to keep in mind here is 2.5%. The first question we sought to tackle with our data is, how do people engage? We found that for many voters, trying to keep up with current events is a chore. And even though a lot of voters say that they follow the news closely, we also see a pretty significant group who admit to trying to avoid the news. And though there are some voters who avoid the news because they just don't want to see certain stories, the conclusion we draw here is that it's how news is covered that turns people off. The prevalence of bias in information is exhausting and annoying to many voters. First, we asked voters to categorize how they approach staying up to date with political news. Is it something they enjoy or not so much? And we see that for pretty sizable pluralities of voters, staying in the know is a chore. Notably, half of people who describe themselves as following the news very closely say that they actually enjoy keeping up with the news and view it as a hobby. But still, 47% of that same group consider it to be a chore. We also wanted to gauge how voters understand their own consumption habits. On the left, we asked people whether they take an active or more passive approach to staying updated on news and current events. Do they seek it out, or do they just happen to hear it while doing other things? And we see that voters overwhelmingly describe themselves as active information seekers. At the same time, a majority of these voters, 62%, say that they are avoiding the news sometimes. And within that, we see that 1/5 of voters, 21%, are saying that they avoid the news most of the time. So now we have this contradicting picture of a voter base who is both actively seeking and actively avoiding news content. So we decided to ask voters directly, why are they avoiding the news? And we saw 3 central themes in qualitative data. First, voters describe themselves as being mentally exhausted. This young white man that I've pulled a quote from talks about how the news is depressing and overwhelming. But within that feeling of overwhelm is also frustration with bias. We see voters complaining about constantly being bombarded with opinions, sensationalism, and polarization in the media, when what they're searching for is unbiased and fact-based reporting. Lastly, we see that there's an undercurrent of general distrust. As this Black voter writes, she avoids the news because she just does not trust mainstream media to report the facts. We see a similar phenomenon in our quantitative data. When we ask voters what bothers them most about how news is reported, they most often select inaccurate or misleading reporting, biased or unfair reporting, and one-sided or unbalanced reporting as their top pet peeves. These frustrations seem linked to why some voters may be disengaging. So now we've established a pattern of engagement, and in that we've shown that voters are really distrustful of news media in the abstract. So who do they trust? Well, when trying to answer this question, we find that voters' lack of trust come from a feeling that media outlets are failing to keep them informed, but the desire to be informed is very much there. And while there is this universal distrust of mainstream media in the abstract, voters are pretty divided when it comes to how they perceive their own sources. We also see a wide spectrum of behaviors when it comes to figuring out who to trust and how to verify information. Something that people may be assuming is that voters are much more concerned about bias for other people, not themselves. While majorities across the board show less concern for bias within their own sources, there are still some interesting differences that we uncovered. First, a generational divide. Voters under 34 are much more likely to be concerned about bias in other people's news diets compared to their older counterparts. We also see that Democrats are more likely than folks who are independent or Republican to be concerned about bias in other people's news media. But what's important to me is that this conversation around bias really centers on a perceived disconnect in values. Voters across all demographic groups overwhelmingly value information. We asked voters what are the most important aspects of news in their lives, and being informed to be a better citizen rises to the top. 57% say it's very important, and an additional 32% say that it's somewhat important. In contrast, when we ask voters what they think the media values more, overwhelmingly, 86% of voters say that media outlets put their bottom lines over reporting the news honestly. But even though so many voters consider media at large to be bottom line focused, we get a different picture when we ask voters to think about their go-to sources. Voters are basically divided down the middle. We have 43% of voters who believe that, unlike the rest of the media landscape, their sources prioritize honest reporting. But we also have another 43% who feel like even their sources are still bottom line focused. Again, we have another generational divide. We see that just over half of voters 18 to 34 think that even their sources are focused more on making money than honest reporting, while there's more of a divide among older cohorts. Interestingly, we also see that independents and Republicans are a little more likely than their Democratic counterparts to be mistrustful of their own sources. In line with our quantitative findings, we see that when we ask people about their frustrations with news, voters hammer home these 2 central points. First, that the news feels overwhelmingly opinion-driven, and second, that these opinions and biases are caused by outlets caring more about views and clicks than they do about giving facts to consumers. So how do voters know who to trust? We see a pretty strong divergence here in our qualitative data. On one side of the spectrum, we see a class of voter who is dedicated to fact-checking, corroborating, and cross-referencing news stories. On the other side, we have people who take more of a trust your gut approach. People in this category often mention using their critical thinking or their past experiences to gauge the truth behind a story. But even beyond that, there's this pretty sizable group of voters who just outright refuse to believe that any news information that they stumble across is true. So I've been talking a lot about news media in the abstract. But figuring out who voters trust really comes down to identifying the specific news sources that they lean on. When we ask voters where they turn to stay informed more generally, we see some pretty significant information silos. When it comes to age group, we see a sizable portion of voters 18 to 34 are getting their news from online sources, social media, and particularly YouTube, more than any other group. There's also a partisan aspect too. For example, when we take a right-leaning media source like Fox News, we see that 51% of Republicans say that they use it to generally access news information. Only 7% of Democrats say the same. On the flip side, we can take a perceived left-leaning news source like NPR, and we see that 41% of Democrats say that it's a go-to news source, but only 8% of Republicans report the same. At the same time, we do see that regardless of partisan identity, a couple of things rise to the top, such as local and network TV news, but prominently social media. With the exception of voters 65 and older, social media is one of the most frequented sources to access news information. Diving even deeper, we asked voters to think of a news story that they came across in recent months, how they first heard about it, and where they went to learn more. And we see that voters overall are most likely to catch wind of a news story through two main channels. First, at 31%, is TV news. This could either mean a local or national TV outlet. And then at 27% is social media, either scrolling with the intent of finding news or scrolling for fun and stumbling across a headline. What's notable here is that there's actually minimal partisan difference when it comes to how people are first finding news stories. The same channels that people first hear about a story also tends to be the exact same channel they continue to learn about that story. They're not straying too far from the source. But we do see that when provided as an option, using a search engine as a news source rises to the top for most voters. But we also see that TV and social media remain the prevalent channels. Voters are sticking to their known sources and not necessarily going out of their way to get more details or information on a story. Given all this information, we wanted to build out consumer profiles and identify who's engaged, who's tuned out, and what makes these voters different. What we've decided to do here is put these behaviors on a grid, because it's not so simple as to say people are tuned in and tuned out. We found that folks can be divided in two ways. First, whether or not they're actively or passively consuming news media, but also whether or not they're actively avoiding media. So our four categories go like this. On the top left, we have our most engaged consumers. These are people who are both actively seeking out the news and rarely avoid it. On the top right, we have people who are also pretty actively engaged, but these are folks who admit that they're avoiding the news at the same time. On the bottom left, we have folks who are not actively seeking out the news, but they're not purposely avoiding it either. They're sort of letting it wash over them without making hard and fast conscious decisions on what they're looking at and what they're not. And lastly, on the bottom right, we have voters who hate engaging with the news and try to avoid it as much as possible, basically as fully tuned out as we can get in these divisions. So what sets these groups apart? When we first broke down these groups, we were surprised to find that there weren't many clear demographic differences, but there are a few noteworthy ones I want to point out. First, when looking at this blue column of our most engaged voters, we see that this group is more likely to identify as Republican compared to any other group and compared to the voting sample as a whole. On the opposite side of the spectrum, when we look at our most disengaged voters, that red column, they're overwhelmingly women, 61%. Lastly, when we look at our yellow column, our group of passive consumers, the folks who don't seek news but also don't avoid it, They have the highest proportion of 18 to 34 voters out of any other group. The more prominent differences, however, come from the behavioral and attitudinal data that we collected. Although local TV and social media are prominent news sources across the board, we see other common sources shift. For our most active consumers, that blue column, potentially due to that Republican lean, we see that Fox News is a go-to source on par with social media. We also see that for our active but avoidant group, that green column, rather than Fox, are turning to other network TV news channels. In both of our passive groups, regardless of whether they are avoiding the news or not, YouTube is actually one of the most prevalent information sources. We also see that for 3 out of our 4 groups, majorities feel that it's easy to stay informed these days. However, for our most disengaged folks, those passive consumers who are also avoiding the news, 50% actually say that it's difficult to stay informed these days, not easy. Next, we also see this divide in top reporting pet peeves when it comes to our active consumers versus our passive consumers. Active consumers show that they are most bothered by inaccurate news, while our passive consumers are most bothered by biased news. Lastly, and personally, what I think is the most important, is that with each group, we see very different avoidance styles. As these profiles show, not all news avoidance is the same. These summaries are taken from analysis of our qualitative data, where we ask voters why they avoid the news. For our most active and engaged voters, they rarely, if ever, avoid the news. And if they do, these breaks are incredibly short and often focused on specific content areas rather than the news as a whole. Our news seekers, that green column, who are currently avoiding the news, often tell us about the necessity of mental health breaks. These breaks are longer and more sweeping than those who are active and non-avoidant, but they're also temporary and strategic. But when we get to our passive consumers who are not purposely avoidant, when they take breaks from the news, the mental exhaustion is much more palpable. Rather than strategic breaks, this can look a lot more like burnout. And lastly, for our most disengaged voters, there's a starkly different approach. These voters primarily the driver for them away from news is a lack of trust. They're not necessarily depressed or overwhelmed or upset about the content of the news, but rather the fact that they believe that all of it is untrue and not worth paying attention to. Despite these differences in engagement, all of these voters are unified by the critique we've been seeing throughout our research, that news media as a whole is untrustworthy. From our most to least engaged voter, there's the sense that the facts are inaccessible to them. We also used these profiles to get a more granular sense of where information is connecting with voters. Because unlike other demographic groups, we see that voters of all stripes are practicing similar media behaviors, particularly being chronically online. We're seeing that social media is a top source for information across all these consumer groups, and pretty sizable majorities of these groups are going on social media multiple times a day. In fact, only 3% of our sample reported that they do not use social media at all. It's incredibly rare not to be plugged in some way. Even though these relationships to social media are pretty similar, we see that people's feeds differ pretty significantly. On the one hand, we see that nearly 2/3 of our most engaged voters say that they see state and national politics on their social media feeds. They're also more likely than any other group to see current events and about goings-on internationally. In contrast, only 21% of the most disengaged and avoidant voters see this type of political content. Instead, entertainment like funny content, content related to their hobbies and interests, and pet content is much more prevalent. So what can we take away from this research? Well, let's start with what we came in thinking and then leave with what we found. One of the first assumptions that we carried into this research is that voters are in these information bubbles. They trust their sources and consider bias to be a problem that affects those outside of themselves, particularly across the aisle. But what we found instead is that there's an acute concern across all voters, regardless of their political identity, when it comes to bias in their own news sources, and they struggle to identify what is true and who to trust. We also came in with an assumption that most voters are disengaged and tuning out for good, that avoiding the news is a sign that voters are disconnecting with what's going on in the world. But what we found is that not all avoidance habits are created equal. In fact, most voters who avoid the news still desire to stay informed and get the facts. One of the last assumptions that we made is that social media is only used by millennials and Gen Z, and that traditional media sources is still the path forward to reach the most people. And while we did see that age still plays a factor, social media is becoming an increasingly dominant part in how people are getting their information, both actively and passively. Voters' frustration with mainstream media is leading to this migration to non-traditional information channels. We are so happy to be able to share this information with you, and we will begin to open up for Q&A, and we look forward to answering any questions you have about our data.
Alrighty. If you like what you saw and would like to get a little bit more information about how we can support your work, especially with understanding, media or other things that are important to your work, I encourage you to use the QR code and get in touch with us. And of course, I have another poll for you. And so it says, after this webinar, I would like to either connect with Change Research about political or partisan work, or you may want to connect with our Embold research team about nonpartisan work, because that's our nonpartisan arm. Or you may be interested in gaining access to our in-depth analysis of the 2024 election, which is a deck that we can share out. Feel free to click multiple options if you're interested in a few of different opportunities. While folks are answering that question, I will move forward with other questions that came up during the presentation. So, Jessica, Tucker asked, when people say they don't trust media to be accurate or honest, are they pretty consistently saying that media is too sympathetic or bought off by the party they don't identify with?
So what we've been finding here, both in the quantitative and qualitative data, is there is this sentiment that there is a lot of wealthy interests or a desire for, bottom line driven, rather than accuracy-driven media reporting, but this is something that seems to be affecting both sides. We see, especially in our qualitative data, when folks tell us why things in the news are bothering them or why they avoid the news, that it's coming from all sides, that that everything seems to be biased. We do see some glimpses, especially when we look at more granular quantitative data about where people are turning to and who people trust, that there are some inherent partisan biases. Those who identify as Democrats tend to consider sources more perceived as left-leaning as more trustworthy or more respectable than perceived right-leaning sources, and the opposite is true for Republicans. However, within that, there is also the sense that even some of the sources that people agree with still struggle and fail to give them fact-based and reporting of the whole truth.
Thank you. An anonymous attendee asked, how do you reconcile the desire for unbiased news and the movement of all media entities towards partisan bias in order to increase profitability? And then the second half of that question is there a difference between what people say they want and what they really want? Or how else do you reconcile these?
Well, the first question I think is really apparent is, on the one hand, we see again that our voter base really wants to be informed, and they're really bothered by this by biased and unfair reporting. At the same time, I think there is two things going on. One, voters are highly aware and feel that these new mainstream media outlets are putting profitability above accurate reporting, and that this is a story about profitability. Again, 86% of voters say that they think mainstream media values sensationalism and clicks and views. I mean, the other issue, though, is that voters are having fewer and fewer places to turn to that they trust. So they have some sources that they do trust, maybe, but they are also turning to sensationalism. So there are fewer and fewer outlets for voters to turn to, or they're going to non-traditional outlets like social media, which are harder to track, if that makes sense.
All right. Chris was interested in knowing, will the deck be made available? And the answer to that is yes. And the second question is, why do you refer to NPR as left-leaning?
So I do want to make a bit of a subtle distinction, which is NPR to our voter base is perceived as left-leaning. I don't want to make a hard distinction either way, but what we're seeing too is in our data that a source like NPR is considered to be liberal by our Republican respondents and not the same for our Democratic respondents. We also asked a specific quantitative question about several different sources across sort of the spectrum from Fox News and even Joe Rogan to things like MSNBC, CNN, and the New York Times. And NPR was a part of that. And we see that when it comes to NPR specifically, Democrats and independents are much less likely to consider NPR a biased source than their Republican counterparts. But Republican respondents consider NPR to be a biased source in line with some sources that are actually marketing themselves as left-leaning that we tested. Oh, Kamal, you're muted. I'm so sorry.
Sorry about that. Thank you. Amber asked, what is the difference between misleading reporting and unfair reporting? And were respondents given examples?
So respondents were not given examples, but when we looked into our qualitative data, it seemed that voters created clear distinctions. When it comes to misleading reporting, they're thinking specifically about not media outlets not sharing the full truth, either spreading purposely misinformation or leaving out facts. When it comes to unfair reporting, this is more in the lines of bias. People are thinking about it specifically from a partisan lens. That one of the comments we see a lot, especially when we see in our quantitative data, that people find many sources to be biased, is they're thinking of a specific political lean. So these points are interconnected. A biased source can often be a misleading or inaccurate source, but they are two distinct problems.
Thank you. Holly Holiday asked, is this data disaggregated by race or sexual orientation?
Yes to both of those things. We have crosstabs that dive really deeply, not just into some of the subgroups which we called out, which included age group and partisan identity, but also gender, sexual orientation, race, as well as some other key measures as well.
And Joni Wickham asked, in your view, does this mean that candidate campaigns and ballot measures should focus more on paid digital comms versus earned media in the short term?
So this is a bit of a difficult question for me as I am primarily working on our in bold side of our operations, which focuses specifically on nonprofits and not on candidate campaigns. What I will say in a more general advice is that we are seeing overall this migration away from traditional media outlets, as well as a distrust of traditional media outlets. Something that we found, at least in our case study for Pacific News, and again, grain of salt, because this is a different scenario, is that we do have some clear alternative channels that we can use. But, it is really about being creative and pairing traditional media efforts with reaching people where they're at, which can be on social media, but also on the ground.
Sorry. Katie Tice asked, does social media in this research include mainstream media outlets, social pages, or is it strictly digital first news pages?
So when we're thinking about social media, we're trying our best to think of it as almost like a news aggregation site where people are not thinking of, oh, I'm going to see New York Times's Instagram page, but rather I am going on Instagram to get my news. So we were trying to think about those main sources such as online news sites or news aggregation sites, podcasts, to try to isolate social media as much as possible. We are very aware that it's become more intertwined than ever, but we really are trying to isolate social media and sort of getting sources from content creators or YouTube channels or non-traditional reporters and figures from, let's say, a podcast or a YouTube channel, or even mainstream media sites like, your local Fox news website, or the New York Times on your iPhone or iPad.
All right. Kelly Hall asked a similar question to a previous one that you answered about media. And given these insights on voter behavior and engagement, do you have any recommendations on media spend to try to engage and persuade voters who likely fall in the avoidant group and are likely to be ignored by traditional campaigns?
Maybe I can take that.
Hmm.
Well, this is something that we're early on in the process of looking at, but we, with Magnify, we are looking to be building models to target specific voters and say where is what media types is this specific voter likely to use, and where might we target that voter. And by doing that, we'll be able to answer this question in a pretty rigorous way, and to say, okay, here's a particular voter. It's likely that they're on these three channels using these three types of media and not these other ones. And that's something that we're planning to do in the near future.
Thank you, Mike. All righty. And now we have another question where they asked, do you have data on trust or satisfaction in local news versus national news? They said, I've seen more bipartisan support for local news versus national news, but they're curious if it's consistent or not with what you're seeing.
So unfortunately, in this data, we did not break out local news sources versus national news sources, but it's definitely something that we want to dive deeper in, given our experiences in our client work, where we're looking specifically at local media markets. We are seeing some key distinctions then compared to when voters are being told to think about the national landscape.
Alrighty, and Justin asked, when you ID social media as a consumption choice and YouTube in the same question, is YouTube a subset of social media or is it in addition to social media?
So this is something that we actually debated internally quite a bit, and what we ended up deciding is to make YouTube specifically separate from social media. One of the things that sets YouTube apart from other social media channels is that it sort of lacks the engagement of reacting both to people on a very interpersonal level. We also see that there's much fewer folks producing content on YouTube compared to other social media, where things like Twitter, Instagram, Reddit, people are posting almost as often as they're consuming. We notice that for most folks, they're going to YouTube to watch content, not to necessarily create content. So we decided to separate out those things. Similarly, that's sort of the strategic thinking as to why we separated podcasts from social media. Although podcast clips are now becoming a really popular way to spread information on social media, they still are sort of these separate entities onto themselves, where if you listen to them in full, and even if you comment on them, they lack that same element that other social media platforms have.
And was there any data on, how to clear up misinformation?
So this is sort of more actionable advice. So what is our data telling us? What we see is, voters really, really want to have unbiased and trustworthy information sources. We actually asked a quantitative question, not just about what bothers people, but also what they value out of a news media source. And what we see here, when we look at what people value most, is that, one second, that people really value honest and truthful reporting, also report at 76%, but also reporting that is explicitly nonpartisan at 66%. The other thing that we see here is that people want proof of fairness and nonpartisanship. So that means things that can be fact-checked easily, and things that cite sources as well. So that will be, even though that's not a full answer, I think different ways to communicate that your source is trustworthy, that it is based in facts, citations, can be potentially a powerful driver to sort of counter misinformation.
An anonymous attendee asked if there are any specific media outlets that both sides consider reliable.
So this is a bit of a tough question because we see there are specific media outlets that, or not specific media outlets, but specific channels that both folks turn to. I was also alluding before to some interesting information we had when we were testing different types of sources from, Joe Rogan to the New York Times, and sources in between. We asked folks how biased they are, or how biased they perceive them to be, how respectful they perceive them to be, and how trustworthy they perceive them to be. And interestingly enough, even though for all of the sources we tested, minorities of voters came to a consensus on what they found to be unbiased, trustworthy, and honest, the one with the sort of highest marks ended up being NPR. But this is not necessarily because a lot of voters do find them trustworthy or do find them unbiased, but rather there was actually a very significant portion of voters who were unsure about that NPR as a source. We had quite a few folks saying that they weren't sure whether or not NPR was biased or whether or not NPR was trustworthy. Whereas when we asked folks about, for example, Fox News, people were more sure in their opinions. We had almost virtually nobody say that they weren't sure and were polarized one way or another as to whether they thought that source was trustworthy.
Ross Sherman asked, is there anything in the data about people trusting individuals like influencers more than institutions like news companies?
I will have to double check on that because we really tried to talk about sources rather than specific individuals, but we did ask open-ended questions about when it comes to podcasts and social media and YouTube specifically, what comes to mind when voters are thinking about that? And we're seeing, at least when people are turning to social media channels, a higher reliance on influencers or content creators rather than institutional figures or even, longtime reporters that are kind of part of these institutions.
And Maxwell brought up podcasts and podcast hosts getting a lot of attention coming out of the election, but the data says that only 20% of voters listen to podcasts. Are there any thoughts on this? And is YouTube considered also a major source for podcasts, and maybe that is a part of the difference?
So I don't have enough data to answer the sort of second part of that question, but the first part of that question, I think, is about who's listening to podcasts. What we see is that overwhelmingly, it's our youngest voters, 18 to 34, who are listening to podcasts. So it's 20% overall, but it's actually if I can have the number, I think it's 30% of people 18 to 34 are listening to podcasts. So when we're thinking about young people's news diets specifically, that's much more popular than, say, network TV news or local TV news stations. However, this is still a small portion, but more traditional things, for example, talk radio, newsletters, and some other local newspapers are less popular than podcasts in the current media news diet of the average consumer that we tracked.
One,
Was religion? Oh, I'm sorry.
one thing I'll add to that, which is that we in other polling we've done, we have seen that podcast listeners, heavy podcast listeners who are 18 to 34 moved pretty significantly from Biden in 2020 to Trump in 2024, and that was a meaningful part of the electoral result.
All right. And another attendee was curious to know if religion was a part of the crosstabs.
Yes, it is.
Tyler asked, if people generally rely on friends and family as a primary news source, does social media serve to simply amplify that factor, or is social media a news source entirely on its own? So is it like advertising versus posts from friends?
So we didn't, in at least our internal poll, we didn't see that folks are relying on friends and family primarily as a news source. This was more in our Chicago case study. But I think you do pose a really interesting question about social media, because when we ask folks about what content they're seeing on social media, even though a lot of people are seeing political content, it's also mixed in with content of their friends and families' lives. So, for example, of our total audience, 47% say that they see information about politics on a national or state level in their social media feeds. Then that's mixed in with the 43% who say they're seeing content about the lives of their friends and family. So it can be sort of hard to differentiate exactly who is the source and whether, relying on word of mouth channels is in part embedded in that social media aspect.
Did you dig into which social media platforms people were getting their information from specifically? And if so, are there any notable demographic or partisan differences?
Yes, we did. And there are actually some pretty notable demographic differences. So we asked folks who use social media for news, what are their sources? And at face value, it looks like the top sources are overwhelmingly Facebook, 55% say they use that, Instagram, 49%, and then Twitter or X at 38%. But what we see here is actually a really huge age divide. When it comes to Facebook, that's overwhelmingly people over the age of 35, particularly people 50 plus. Conversely, when we're talking about Instagram, that's being dominated by our younger voters. So 2/3 of voters 18 to 34 who use social media for news say that they're getting it on Instagram. We're also getting some partisan differences as well. So Twitter or X is a much more popular news source among Republicans than it is their independent or Democratic counterparts. We also see that when it comes to some other stuff, we tested also Blue Sky and Threads, and we see that while they are up and coming, they are much less prominent news sources than we would expect at 14% and 13%, respectively.
Were there any geographic differences in determining whether a source was deemed reliable and trustworthy?
I did not see any specific geographic differences that stood out to me, but I know one of the conversations that has been happening in the world of media consumption is this conception of a news desert, where either it's more academically defined as areas where there's just a dearth of local news sources. So local newspapers and reporting has had its doors shuttered, and people are lacking places to go to figure out what's going on locally. But it's also people talking about news deserts as people, these sort of geographic areas of folks who just happen to be less informed than other people, and we're not sure why. When we're looking at our data, especially because it is on a national scale, it's a little bit harder to parse those geographic differences. And especially when we made our consumer profiles, I was surprised to see that it's actually spread pretty geographically evenly. But this is research that we do want to continue because we know that, especially on a local level, that geography plays a huge factor.
Did you look at, and I'm sure you did, but urban versus rural differences? I think some folks are interested in that.
Yes, definitely. And we did look at that. And again, I was surprised about sort of the lack of difference there. We see, some differences in urban and rural, but these are also potentially overlaid by the fact that we're seeing pretty intense partisan differences. So when we're looking at super urban city centers, and then we see that they're mostly Democratic, and we're seeing that our partisan trend lies the same way. It's a little hard. It's more difficult to make those distinctions between whether this is something that's driven by partisanship or something that's driven by urbanicity or both.
And you didn't mention TikTok or Reddit specifically. Were they included in social media?
They were. TikTok and Reddit were included when we asked social media questions. What we saw, similar to Instagram, but to a lesser degree, is that TikTok and Reddit are very much dominated by our younger audience. 43% of 18 to 34-year-olds who use social media for news rely on TikTok, and 41% rely on Reddit. So still pretty significant, but just not as dominant as Instagram, which I found pretty surprising given the prevalence of discourse around TikTok. This in part might be because people are using TikTok for more than just news, because we asked specifically about where they're going for news content. And TikTok, I think, in a way, has really diversified its portfolio of content and content creators that people are picking up on.
Did you happen to cover Substack or trust in Substack writers?
We did also cover Substack. We considered Substack less of a social media and more of a newsletter, but specifically called out Substack in one of our asks. And we see that folks turn to these subscription-based newsletters in pretty small amounts at 14%, but are more likely to be younger and lean Democratic compared to some other news sources.
All righty. And I think we have time for one more question. Someone asked, was radio included in broadcast? And do you know if people have preferences across social media channels? I think we kind of went over that already, but I think it may be good to acknowledge whether or not radio was included.
So radio was included. We actually wanted to sort of block it out into two components. We know that National Public Radio is its own entity, but there's still talk radio that exists that is not podcasts. So we did include that as well.
Oh, and I know I said that was the last one, but this is another good question. Did we segment groups out by race and demographic? So like race and type of community that they live in.
Yeah, so what we did for now is, in addition to having race, given we only have about 1,700 folks and we want the data to be statistically significant, is we looked at some some specific groups, gender or race, excuse me. We looked at some specific racial groups by gender and also by over and under 50 age cohort. When we try to break it out by urbanicity specifically, because of the size of our sample, we were unable to get sort of effective or large enough sample sizes to make determinations about whether folks of color in urban areas versus rural areas have different opinions, for example. But that is in our crosstabs of all of this data.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jessica and Mike, for answering everybody's questions, as many questions as we could. And thank you guys for coming and joining us today and being so inquisitive about the data. We look forward to sharing more information with you. We look forward to working with you in the near future. And happy Valentine's Day. See you guys.